of the Timken Museum. Just a few items before we get started. If we could all just keep ourselves muted throughout today's presentation, that would be great. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them up in the chat, and we will get to them near the end of the discussion today. That goes for the Facebook Live as well. If you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll get those answered at the end of the tour. Let's see, today the tour is being live streamed. So if you'd like to go back and watch any part that you may have missed, or if you'd like to watch any other tours, you can always go to our Facebook page and check those out there. So today we have Karen presenting on 19th century American art, the Hudson River painters. So with that being said, Karen, I'm going to hand things over to you, and you're all good to go.
Thank you so much, Haley. We bid a fond adieu to Haley as she goes back to university, and we will be welcoming another wonderful intern to the Timken family, and her name is Sarah, and we'll see her probably next time. So the 19th century American Hudson River painters, what a wonderful subject. Part of the reason why I chose this subject is because the Timken has an extraordinary collection of Hudson River painters. Some of the best painters of this time period can be viewed at the Timken. So let's talk a little bit about what the Hudson River painters, what is it all about? It's really the truly first American art movement. So much of what was going on in art was based in Europe, as you probably know. But this is more of a national movement of pride and celebration for our great country, the beauty of westward expansion. We begin to see all these wonderful landscapes across our country and moving away from this sort of European control. Now, that is not to say that European artists did not influence the Hudson River painters. For example, the work in the 17th century of Claude Lorrain and Nicolas Poussin from France. Later in the 19th century, we see the work of J.M.W. Turner in England and John Constable. And those two artists are very important to the movement. What are the themes in the Hudson River style of painting? Well, the themes are discovery, exploration, and settlement. So that was going on in America at this time. I also want to remind you of a couple of political things going on. Remember, the Civil War in 1861 begins, and you will see, I'm going to show you some paintings. They're actually done around the time, this one in particular, our Bierstadt at the Timken, was done in 1863 during the American Civil War, and I'll explain how that occurred. And also when you look at artists like Winslow Homer, who actually captured Union soldiers. So the Civil War was an important factor during this time period. Another thing is industrialization. Industrialization occurs later in America, in the early part of the 1800s, after Europe, after England and France. But you begin to see, when we look at some of the paintings, how this encroaching industrialization affects the way these artists paint. Couple other things I need to mention is literary and artistic movements factor greatly into the Hudson River painters. Now, they're called the Hudson River painters because it started in the Hudson River Valley with the work of Thomas Cole, but it began to expand into tangential areas like the Catskills, the Adirondacks, and the White Mountains. But after the first generation of Hudson River painters, Asher B. Durand, Thomas Cole, Thomas Doherty, had moved on or passed away, we have a whole second generation. And these artists actually went to places like Bierstadt did, to the West Coast, to the Rocky Mountains, even to parts of Europe and South America. When I say that there is some artistic and literary movements attached to the Hudson River painters, we do want to mention a couple things. The Transcendentalist movement, which was led by Ralph Waldo Emerson and his disciple Henry David Thoreau with his Walden Pond, they sought this desire to move to the spirituality and beauty of our grand landscape. You didn't necessarily have to be in a church or synagogue to witness the beauty of God and spirituality. The Transcendentalists also were abolitionists and philosophers. So many of the artists who painted were accustomed to knowing or being informed by these philosophers. Another thing I did want to mention is there is a group called the Knickerbocker Group. And if you think about people like Henry, Cooper, if you also think about James Fenimore Cooper, sorry, William Cullen Bryant, who you'll see in just a moment, and Washington Irving. Think about Last of the Mohicans, The Deerslayer. These were literary books that sort of mirrored what was happening with the Hudson River painters. So I'm just going to go to the first painting, Kindred Spirits. But again, I wanted you to look at this magnificent painting, and I want to tell you a little bit more about the movement. What you have to see is Thomas Cole, who was actually British, had come to America and just fallen in love with this grand landscape. And as early as 1820, he began to focus his interests on the Hudson River Valley and tangential regions because he was just um, amazed at their beauty. In 1825, Thomas Cole took a steamer up the Erie Canal. They had just opened it, and he began to explore this region of the Hudson River Valley. And he began to bring friends there. And he was so inspired that he began to connect with other writers and thinkers to show them the beauty. Stylistically, let's look at this painting, for example, Kindred Spirits, and we'll talk a bit about it in just a second. But you can see that there is a romantic element to it. Romanticism was a really big part of the Hudson River painters. Also, this idea of naturalism, realism, but with this aura of romanticism. So when you think about the ineffable beauty of nature, as you can see in this magnificent painting, you can see why there is a little beyond just pure realism. And in this case, for example, and in many paintings, the artist would kind of subtract elements of the landscape that were unappealing. For example, even with the some of these paintings, people were encroaching on the landscapes, and the artist did not want to depict them because they weren't very beautiful. Spirituality factors greatly into this movement. And another painting style that does influence these artists is the Barbizon painters, but that comes in the second generation. So we'll leave that until we get to those artists. All right. So Thomas Cole, who is actually featured in this painting. This painting is by Asher B. Durand, one of the first generation. Some put him in the second generation, but my studies show he's more first generation Hudson River painter. He painted his great friend Thomas Cole. And this painting was actually done the year after Thomas Cole died. But it's an homage to him. And here he is standing on a rocky promontory with William Cullen Bryant, the great writer. And Bryant and Cole both revered nature, and they were simpatico. They were, quote, kindred spirits. And where does that line, kindred spirits, come from? It's actually John Keats. And he talked about solitude, and he talked about the importance of beauty in nature, and also to share that love with others. So here we have Thomas Cole on my right, and he's holding a like an attaché case with drawings in it, or maybe a sketchbook, and he's talking to Bryant, and Bryant holds his hat in his hand. And if you look really closely, and it's kind of hard to see, on one of these trees, you can actually see their initials carved. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a very exquisite scenario, this beautiful, beautiful landscape. And again, he used poetic and artistic license to create it. It's not exactly this way, but it's very clear, it's very meticulous. It captures the sublime. God seems to be in nature. And it's also based on individualism, like we can be in charge of our own destiny. Before I go on to just talk about the paintings, I want to say there was some negative things going on in America at this time. We have in 1848 this manifest destiny, which actually pushes the idea, and I'm saying it very concisely, but this sort of pushes the idea of the white settlers sort of have a destiny to take over. And that actually affected Black citizens, it affected Native Americans. So it wasn't always a positive thing. So some great things are happening in America this time, and some things that are not exactly positive. So in this painting, we also see how when Cole discovered the region, as I mentioned, he took the Erie Canal up 20 years before, he was just taken aback and how beautiful it was. And you see also sort of an Arcadian landscape, meaning it's so beautiful, it's almost otherworldly. So what we're looking at is the Catskills area, and it's the Catskill Mountains and Cove, or I should Falls and Cove. So that little waterfalls, Catskill Waterfall and Cove, and he really wanted to share how much he revered this landscape and sharing it with this extremely important friend, Asher B. Durand. Now, let's talk specifically about Thomas Cole. He inspired the first generation of Hudson River painters, and he was actually British. He came from England, immigrated to the US. He was sort of an itinerant artist going around and painting. He did portraits and genre scenes. But when he began to come to this region of America, he fell so deeply in love with it. He stayed and did many works of art. How he became famous really is John Turnbull, who was an American Revolutionary painter, collected Cole's work and really promoted it. So that kind of gave him a lot of recognition. He also was an early member of the Academy of Design, National Academy of Design, and there he met other artists. So this particular painting, and he died young. He died at 47, I believe. The Course of the Empire, Savage State. This reflects how he felt about the American landscape and that we have our own destiny, and that prior to industrialization and other things that are occurring in America, we had this natural habitat, and Native Americans were that's sort of a pejorative, were able, eventually wasn't allowed, were able to live in peace and harmony. Of course, we know that quite a bit changes. So this is part of, I believe, a 5-series paintings. This is the first, The Course of the Empire, because he wanted to show the best, the most beautiful part of our empire. And here we have a Native American with bow and arrow, and he's hunting. And we see other hunters here in the mid-distance. And we have deer fleeing. And then we have teepees with fire. And we also have very small, you can see canoes on the water. But the one thing that Cole wanted to talk about is when we begin to industrialize and move into the landscape, we also, not only do we disrupt the landscape, but we kind of show our gluttony and how it eventually could destroy this magnificent landscape. You see the dawning of a stormy day, and you see the clouds surrounding the mountains and the green, lush vegetation, and it's really, really quite remarkable. So we'll go on to another one. This is a distant view of Niagara Falls. And when I was preparing this lecture, I remembered as a young woman, I went with my husband to Niagara Falls. We actually were on the Canadian side, but it's so close. And I thought, it's magnificent, but there's so much rather unsightly buildings, a lot of cheap motels and tourist traps and things like that. And I remember thinking, oh, it's just really too bad that this has occurred. Well, believe it or not, when Cole painted this magnificent work, some of that was already existing. So they started to have factories nearby. There was sort of places for people to stay. Tourists were flocking to see its grandeur. So he hearkened to a time when it was still beautiful, still sublime, and really celebrating its magnificence. So here we have 2 Native Americans, and he uses scale to show you how large the falls are, but actually, in a way, it's a little bit, let's say, exaggerated. There's a bit of exaggeration in scale and falls, but suffice to say, it's still quite beautiful. It shows how unspoiled America was, the beauty of its nature. So he takes out those hotels and factories and scenic overlooks. And he wants you to remember the romantic and beautiful aspects of this area. Now, Asher B. Duran, I talked a little bit about it. He was a friend of Cole's and also a early, actually, this was a little bit later, but he was an early Hudson River painter. And this is just magnificent. And if you are familiar with the Barbizon painters, I have talked about them in some of these lectures. The Barbizon painters started a little bit earlier in the Barbizon woods. They were French painters, artists like Theodore Rousseau, Diaz de la Peña, and others began to paint in this area outside of Fontainebleau. Of course, this is not Fontainebleau. This is American, but they were inspired because they were the Hudson River painters were inspired by some of these Barbizon painters because they studied their paintings, and some of them actually went to Europe and studied them. So here we have this magnificent foliage and trees, this dark forest, and some of the leaves are decaying and falling. There's trees that are living and dead. And what he really wanted you to do when you looked at this painting is absorb the landscape, smell, metaphorically, the decaying leaves, the fresh air, see the sunshine, think about the atmosphere. And he does it so successfully. So this is one of his most important paintings. Now, we're going to talk about another artist, Thomas Doty. And he, again, as I mentioned, is one of the first generation of Hudson River painters. He was born in Philadelphia. He lived there until about 1828. And he did some odd jobs. He was a leather worker. I believe his father was involved with that. But then he began to paint early landscapes around Pennsylvania. He did a study at the Academy of Arts there, but he struggled to make a living. Then he began a little bit earlier to paint landscapes. And how he was taught, he really didn't study with Hudson River painters. He studied the work of mostly 17th century Europeans, Dutch landscaping like by Hobbema and Van Rysdale. So there is a bit of a different quality to his work. Some people would say a little formulaic, a little predictable. I don't really get that feeling, but you might say that is the case because if you compare him to what people like Church is doing, and we'll see his work, and Bierstadt, where they really extend the magnificent of the landscape, you might get that. This seems a little storybook, as it were. But definitely that low horizon line, Van Rysdale, he actually looked at some of the art paintings in the Louvre, paintings in Holland. He might have even studied at The Hague for a while. So you see this exquisite harbor landscape, and the light is very diffuse, and the boats float quietly. We can compare it a little bit later to the luminous painters. It isn't quite a luminous painting, but you do see an emphasis on light and calmness and beauty. And remember these artists and these philosophers like Emerson and Thoreau. There's beauty and comfort and solitude, what John Keats was saying, and these artists were trying to represent. All right, this is in the Catskills. Again, he shows a lone figure with a dog, and it's very quiet. It's very contemplative. It's almost elegiac. It's almost elegiac, and it shows the sense of awe that we feel when we enter this landscape and what many people saw and felt when they began to explore. And it is definitely an era when we are going across America and trying to find out more about our country. So Doty is one of the early Hudson River painters. Now we're going to go to just an amazing artist. And of course, this painting is in our very own Timken collection. Currently, it is not in our American gallery. We have some new pieces not new chronologically, but new pieces that have come in that are quite nice too. But one day it'll be up and you'll be able to see how remarkable this is. So Birch was British also, and he was introduced to American art, but he did bring some European cultural aspects to his art. What he wanted Americans to realize is the importance of marine paintings. So he was considered the first truly great marine landscape painter, marine painter, as it were, or seascape painter. And as I told you earlier, even though we think about the early Hudson River painters doing the Hudson River Valley, the Catskills, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, these artists began to extend their subject matter and go into things like the sea or going into the West Coast to capture. So that's not always now focused on just the Hudson River Valley. So he assisted his father in training, and he worked primarily as a miniaturist, but then he began to paint much larger paintings. And he loved the work of some of the British painters like J.M.W. Turner and John Constable. Those are really important artists because Constable was known as a landscape painter who showed man quietly coexisting in nature. And he was an early to mid 19th century painter. And then there's J.M.W. Turner. When you think about the Houses of Parliament, and his work was almost abstract. And he showed how man does not always coexist peacefully in nature. And sometimes nature can overcome us. So in this American Ship in Distress, we definitely see more of a Turner-esque quality. This ship is in great distress. And what's happened is it's been caught in a storm and it's about to capsize. And we see torn rigging and sails. The boat is tipping. We see lifeboats being lowered in order to allow people to get in and be saved. On the left, we see a steamboat trying to come out and help. And then we have another lifeboat here. So it definitely shows, and the waves and the movement. And we really appreciate how he depicts the power of the sea. Now, Birch had actually become popular around after the War of 1812 because he did a series of boat disasters and battle scenes. And so that's kind of where he got his start, but a magnificent seascape and marine painter. Something else he did, which is quite different. If you compare this painting, I'm going to go back just a moment. Look at how hyper detailed this is. Remember I said the Hudson River painters were interested in realism and naturalism, but they could also go a little bit of, let's say, personal vision. So the view of Philadelphia Naval Yard is an homage to his adopted city of Philadelphia and the city he called home for many years. This is a busy waterway, on the Delaware River. And this was a separate painting, but he also participated in creating these books with his father of life around Philadelphia. Well, why is that important? There's a sense of pride of place in Philadelphia because from 1790 to 1800, it was our capital. And so, and the Continental Congress was involved with Philadelphia, as you know, and people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, some of our greatest Americans, were so interested in how Birch depicted this area that they would buy the paintings or at least the books. And so they wanted to really see how our capital at that time was documented. So let's just really specifically look at the painting a bit. It's very diffused in light, and we have like 3 bands. So the first band is along sort of the quay, and we have this wooden blockade, so to speak, and the boats are about ready to take off. Then we have this, again, with that diffused, muted sea, and actually sea, I'm sorry, it's the river, the Delaware River. And then we have this magnificent sky. And you can see such a great influence of, great influence of the 17th century Dutch painters with that low horizon line and the billowy clouds. If you look at our very own Van Rysdale in the Timken collection, you can see just how he puts that low horizon line and really emphasizes these billowy clouds. One other person I did want to mention, and we can look at when we sort of move away from seascapes, is Frederick Law Olmsted, because this was also a time of the conservationist movement. When we look at the work of Thomas Moran, who's in the Timken, and others, they were promoting the idea of having a natural park system. And Olmsted, who was actually one of the great landscape architects, was involved with this. So other really great things are happening during this time period, and I'll emphasize it a little bit later when we get to those paintings. So Fitzhenry Lane represents a subcategory of Hudson River painters called the luminous. And of course, you know the word luminous relates to light, the luminosity. And he wanted to show how sublime and beautiful light could be. And of course, also, he looked at 17th century Dutch landscape painters, particularly one, Robert Salmon, and of course, Hobbema and Van Rysdale. And he loved how they captured light. Dr. Berry influence were interested in light, these low horizon lines, very beautiful and quiet and ups, just hauntingly beautiful. And it's done on a grid. So when you look at these ships in this harbor, and I'm going to go back to this. So again, this is the Turner view, influenced by Turner, man being overcome by nature. But then you come here to a more Constable-esque painting, and of course, the luminous quality of the light and how quiet and placid it is. And I'll tell you a little bit about him as an artist, but I will say that if you look at this painting, you kind of think it's on the grid of a grid, like mathematical precision, and it very much is. So Lane was born in Gloucester, Mass, 1804. His father was a sailmaker, and he loved all things nautical, and he hoped to be a naval officer or something like that. But when he was a young boy, he suffered from polio, and he realized he could not do that. He could not be a military officer. And so he began to realize that his art was really pretty extremely good, and that he could actually be a painter. So he went along the eastern seaboard and painted, and this happens to be Castine Harbor in Maine. Castine Harbor, unfortunately, was a site of a very bad loss to the the American revolutionary fighters during the Revolutionary War, and they lost many people here. So it has a kind of a sad negative connotation, but it's still a magnificently beautiful harbor. So he would go along the eastern seaboard and paint, and he would go in a little skiff and sometimes go with people that helped him, and he would capture its beauty. You see a lot of sharp detailing in the painting, a lot of light, of course. You've got all cirrus cumulus clouds. You have the moon sort of showing through. You see the shoreline, and these boats just float quietly. And it reflects a hushed, again, almost elegiac quality to this painting. And the coloration is magnificent. It's particularly beautiful if you see this painting in our very own Timken collection, but it's the blues, the peaches, the yellows, just exquisite. This is one of my favorites. It reminds me of like a fairy tale. It is so quiet and gorgeous. So this is Penobscot Bay. These are lumber schooners. And look at the hyper detail he uses. You can see the figures. You can see the little lifeboat, the sails rolled up. You can see the detail on the boat. But look at that sky. It's evening, dusk is falling, and it's unbelievably quiet and beautiful. It's idyllic. And look at the gorgeous colors he uses, the peaches and the blues. And he gives a lot of the action of the waves. And you can see how the Transcendentalist movement did affect these artists, because it's this beauty and quiet in nature that we begin to sort of feel a religious and spiritual connection to our world. And I think this one definitely demonstrates that quality. All right, so we're going to go to a really amazing artist, and that is Frederick Edwin Church. And Church was from Hartford, Connecticut. I think his family was actually involved with starting the Wadsworth Athenaeum, or at least contributing to it, because he came from a very wealthy family. In fact, his family was so important that they found a connection with Thomas Cole, and this was painted just after Cole's death. But when Cole was alive and Frederick Edwin Church was younger, he studied for 2 years with Cole, the greatest at that time Hudson River painter. One thing that Church did is he painted very large scale. His paintings were like 4 by 6, 5 by 7. I mean, they were huge, monumental paintings. And so we'll look closely at this romantic vision of the Hudson River Valley to the Catskill Mountains. And you see a solitary figure, again, sort of after Thoreau or John Keats, solitude, the beauty of solitude. And you see sort of the uh, moss and plants on the mountain range, and he looks to the Hudson River Valley, and you see in the distance this exquisite light as it falls in a morning. You can imagine a hiker, this dramatic scenery he comes upon, and it just gives him this spiritual awakening. So this is morning looking over the Hudson River Valley to the Catskills. Just this the power and beauty of nature. So there's something really interesting about Church that I really want to talk about. Church did something quite remarkable, and that is he conceived of a way of showcasing his great monumental paintings and actually earning a little income. So what he did is he would find in New York, and then later it went into London and Boston, and this is one of the paintings. He had been visiting the Andes. This was in Ecuador, I believe. He spent 9 weeks in Ecuador sketching, and he did that in the spring of 1857. What he decided to do is showcase these great artworks in one painting exhibitions. And they found that as many as 12 to 13,000 viewers would come in, walk into this exhibition space that was lit with these particular types of light, these gas jet lights, and they gave this sort of weird atmospheric lighting. And people would just see it almost like cinematography. It was almost like going into a movie theater. It was that grand and that inspiring. So these paintings were unveiled in New York. And as I say, these gas jets lit the room, this darkened room, this chamber where you entered, and you felt like you were part of the scenery. So this is probably Ecuador the Andes, sorry. And here we have the mountain range, and we have this beautiful waterfall, and it looks like a gravesite. So we get this idea of the grandeur of the Andes, and we see in the distance this mountain range, the sky as a light as it falls so beautifully on the water and the small pools here. And it may even be a figure or two kneeling before this cross. So these are very popular paintings, and probably his most famous was this one, the icebergs. Now, unfortunately, when this was shown, the war was beginning to break out, and people weren't that interested in New York cultural scene. So this was actually taken down after a very brief unveiling. So let's talk about this one. Some of these artists did travel, and Church had the means definitely to travel. And so he went in Europe and South America. This is part of a trip he took to Canada, and he went to Newfoundland and Labrador to look at these icebergs. And wow, what do you see? A melding of ice and water and sky, icicles. It's so powerful. Many say this was his greatest painting. And of course, this was super large too. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, it was shown in the same manner. We have here all kinds of diffuse light. We have a broken mask. It's embedded in the ice here, and you kind of wonder, what has happened? Well, this is a very treacherous part of the waterways, and so it could have likely been a ship had capsized or crashed in. And you see the afternoon light as it falls on this magnificent iceberg. You see this turquoise water that seems to be heading into a grotto, and then the light as it falls on these icy promontories. And then, of course, is deep, looks like almost like a well. So it went to Boston, it went to London. People love them. They drew generally great praise, but of course, unfortunately, with the American Civil War, it was taken down. Now, an important artist that you could also see in the Timken is Albert Bierstadt. And Bierstadt was actually German. He was born in Germany and moved to the US as a child. He was only about 2 years old. He began to study art as a young man. And then he decided to return to Germany for his education, his art education. And he studied with what's called the Dusseldorf Studio or Dusseldorf School. And that was involved with Emanuel Lutz, Leutze, who was known for painting George Washington. Um, Another thing that Albert Bierstadt did is that he traveled with the Land Road Survey Program, and he came to the Rocky Mountains. He came to to Yosemite, which we'll see momentarily, and he was documenting what he was seeing, particularly when you go to the Yosemite Valley, because these are some of the first white surveyors to come into that region. At this one, A Storm in the Rocky Mountains, Mount Rosalie. Where does the name Mount Rosalie come from? Well, it's a little bit of a little difficult topic, but he was actually having an affair with one of the members of the survey program. Lowell, his name was. And unfortunately, Mr. Lowell had developed quite an opium addiction and was not a very responsible person at this time. And not to condone this in any way, but Bierstadt was having an affair with his wife, but he did eventually marry her, and her name was Rosalie, and Rosalie Bierstadt. And so this is named after the woman he fell in love with. So here we have a mountainside, and it's covered with pine and aspen trees and wildflowers and grasses, and sort of a typical Rocky Mountain view. And he did take a very arduous expedition to get to this point. But he did use some artistic license, of course. Some of the mountains here are a little bit larger, the scale's a little bit different, but it doesn't matter. You still feel thrilled and awed by this magnificent painting. Look at the sky. You can't help thinking that there is this really determined spiritual quality. Again, this connection to the Transcendentalist movement, the beauty and grandeur of the American landscape. And it really thrilled people to see these paintings. All right, so this is in our very own Timken collection. And I do want to apologize. The painting is magnificent. Unfortunately, the slide I have does not do justice to the painting. It is much richer and deeper in color. So this is a washed out version. I really apologize, but please go to the Timken for so many reasons. But one of them is to see the true color of this painting. So Choluk Falls, Yosemite. Here he is. He's part of the survey group, and it is actually done during the American Civil War, which is kind of unique, but they were still doing some of these surveys out on the West Coast. He traveled west in 1859, as you saw by the other painting, and then again in 1863. So one thing I want to point out is that photography obviously had been invented by this time. When you think of Henry Fox Talbot and Louis Daguerre, they were already experimenting with photography. And by this time, photography was being used. It was documented in the American Civil War, for example. But why was he not taking pictures to go back to his studio and paint? Because photography was still extremely cumbersome with the apparatus that you use, with the chemicals. It was just not going to be realistic to use photography. So he sketches. And here in the foreground of the painting, you see 6 artists, and they're kind of talking. It's dusk. They're about to prepare their dinner with a campfire, and they're hobbling the horses so they don't take off. You see the Merced River, the amazing Choluk Falls. And at this time, it was second only to, of course, Niagara. And in the foreground, too, on this rocky outcropping, you see some of his materials, probably his paints, his brushes. And so they were just documenting the beauty and grandeur of the American West. And he did achieve great success, sort of in the same lines of Church, but eventually by 1880, something like that, his work kind of fell out of favor. It was considered a little retro. A lot was happening in Europe that influenced what was like Impressionism begins pretty soon after, maybe 10 years after, 8 years after. So he didn't die with great wealth, although he started out that way, but he was always considered a magnificent artist. All right, George Inness, and this again is in our collection, and you can see why I was so inspired to do this, because you can actually go to the Timken and really feast your eyes on these magnificent paintings. So I told you that artists would often go to other places past the Hudson River Valley, and they would go to Europe to study. They would go to South America, Canada, and of course, George Inness did that. So George Inness was raised in New York and Newark, New Jersey. He had a kind of a difficult life. He was epileptic. By age 7, he had been quite ill. And so he didn't really have very formal training. But he did visit Italy in 1850 and later again in 1853. And then around the time this painting was done. And he began to study a lot of the European artists. He also looked at some of the French painters who did Barbizon painting, as I mentioned, the Barbizon woods. He loved the work of Theodore Rousseau, probably one of the most important members of that school. And when he came back to America after studying in Europe and documenting what he saw, he became a part of what's called the Swedenborg movement, which is sort of tangentially connected to Transcendentalism. But it's a philosophy and a religion. He's a pretty religious guy, but also felt that the landscape was very spiritually enlightened. So here he is painting what's called Aricia. And it's a town outside of the city of Rome toward the south. And you see a bridge and people are traveling along the bridge. And it's quite remarkable. And then you see this whole town. And you actually see a church by Bernini, Santa Maria Assuntia. And that is right here depicted, the cupola here. And then again, this beautiful, magnificent light. And he probably recorded it through sketches. And then, of course, came back to his studio in New York and painted it in 1874. So very influenced by some of the European painters. And you get a sense of a European quality to this painting. You might not know was even done by an American Hudson River painter. Now, one of my favorite artists, and of course, we have some of his work in the Timken, and that's going to be the next painting I show you. And probably one of the greatest paintings he ever did will be shown in just a moment. This is at the Centennial Museum of Art. It's also a lovely painting by Eastman Johnson. So who was Eastman Johnson? He was an American painter, and he was co-founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. In fact, his name is carved in the entryway, above the entryway. And so he was a co-founder, also came from money, was kind of high society. He began as a young man to paint genre paintings, and then he began to do more portraits. And he did everything from prominent people like Abraham Lincoln, Ralph Waldo Emerson, but he also did everyday people. So he was quite a remarkable portrait painter. He was friends with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and also he looked at the Dutch painters very much. Look at this painting, Woman Reading. You see a quality of a Dutch painting in here. We have the low horizon line, very low horizon line. We see a sailing ship that seems to mirror this woman's hat. It's almost like the sails on her head. She's quietly reading. You see the waves, you see the grass. The ocean is visible. You kind of see a little bit of movement here. And he had also studied at The Hague, and so he was very aware of many of these great Dutch painters. So one of the most important American paintings ever done is this one, and it happens to be in our Timken collection, and it's considered his best painting. If you really want to learn more about this painting, I suggest you look at an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was done, I believe, in 2017. If you can Google Robert L. Pincus, actually, I'm honored to say he's a friend of mine. He's a great writer, critic, professor. He's written something like 7 books on art. And he talks about this painting in this article for the Wall Street Journal. I think every couple of years he reviews paintings and with such clarity and insight. I highly recommend it if you want to learn a little bit more. So this painting shows American rural life, and it's actually a narrative, but he's moving away from really telling a story. He wants to just capture a moment in American history. And what is he saying? Well, look at the time. You know, the Industrial Revolution, which kind of goes to the Civil War era, is already well established. American life has changed. In fact, we're on the verge of the Gilded Age, the verge of the Gilded Age, and where these people are making enormous amounts of money. Society is changing, and he harkens back to a time when it was quieter and we were more of an agrarian community. And he shows something he saw. He liked to go to Nantucket. He was a wealthy guy. He had a home in New York, he had a home out here, and he watches as more than 40 people are assembled picking cranberries. And he also took quite a bit of time to do this painting. In fact, the Timken many years ago did a brilliant exhibition where they brought in all the preparatory drawings for this magnificent painting. And there were something like 17. I got to see them. And it shows how he assembled this painting like a puzzle. And he has the little boy bringing the baby to the mother. The mother is here as sort of a beacon. We have a sign pointing the way to different places. We have a church, a lighthouse, and a church and a lighthouse, and we see factories back there and a windmill. So he's showing sort of that encroachment of industrial life and advancement, but also, again, with these beautiful light and the sort of pastoral quality of this painting. He really lavishes attention on the light, the faces, even each blade of grass, the overturned cranberries. He's witnessing a time when America was more, I don't know, less complicated perhaps. And as Robert L. Pincus points out, is that probably in all of American painting, and maybe even European painting too, this is one of the few instances where I see a community gathering together to achieve an important goal. And that is being seen here. Winslow Homer. Winslow Homer is kind of the segue from other aspects of American painting and the Hudson River. And some people might say, well, there's other painters that you're not mentioning. Well, I couldn't do all, of course, and we're really just doing a time period of about 50 years. But I did want to focus on the Hudson River painters, not to say that there wasn't other great painters, but Winslow Homer is kind of the segue. So if you look at this, and I had talked about luminous painting, you can see a luminous quality to this work. And Winslow Homer was educated in Boston. He was a lithographer. He did artwork for Scribner's and other magazines. But eventually, and then he also documented the American Civil War. He went out to the battlefields. He studied in France. He's a really involved and complicated person. He actually went to England a little bit after this painting was done. So when we look at this beautiful sort of calm, bucolic, as it were, seascape, the children are kind of at play and they're in the harbor and it's beautiful. And then he began to say, wait a minute. I went to England and I saw how these fishermen lived in this one region, and it was terrible. It was really, really, let's say, treacherous and dangerous, the work they did. So if you look at this next painting, comparatively speaking, this is a brilliant painting. So the fog warning. It's a marine subject. It depicts the hard lives of the fishermen. And again, he went to England and documented not only American fishing culture, but also very much English. And you see a dory, and this man is rowing, and he's got these big, beautiful halibut, but he's trying to get back to the boat. And this fog warning is like, you have got to get back to the main boat, or you're going to be lost in fog and you may perish. And he looks over, and it's not with, oh, calmness and beauty. He's disturbed. This is treacherous. This is a treacherous moment for this man. And you can almost see his profile sort of replicated here in the cloud formations, this fog as it rolls in. There's definitely movement on the water. And you can see in the distance, the ship he's trying to row so quickly to. And then there's a disturbing quality to the painting, I have to say. Okay, I'm running a little low on time. I only have about 5 minutes, so I do want to show you again, in our own Timken collection, Martin Johnson Heade. And he was known to be a very unique Hudson River painter because he painted in South America. He painted in Florida, traveled all over. He loved South America and he loved flowers and birds. He loved the salt marshes of New England and captured those. His was almost most romantic of some of these Hudson River painters. He studied with a painter called Edward Hicks, and he did travel quite a bit. So this painting in our very own Timken collection is a beautiful magnolia blossom, and it's very sculptural in quality. And he painted it when he was living in Florida. He did about 15 of these magnolia blossoms, but all but this one were done on blue velvet. But there's something so striking about this red velvet. You see this voluptuous blossom. It's luxurious, it's striking, it's sculptural, and you see a very realistic treatment of light. It's perfect, except for one or two browning leaves. It's almost perfect. And the Dutch looked at flowers and it kind of revealed the cycle of life. Pick a flower, it's beautiful, it's young, and it opens and blossoms. So here we have a more opening of the flower. This is another painting by him, because I said that he did do like the salt marshes and the waterways. And this is a very elegiac painting. And we see this approaching thunderstorm, but it isn't this thunderstorm. It's the preamble, which is so remarkable. It's so beautiful, metaphorical. So we know that things are going to change. And because he studied the Dutch, and we know that the Dutch, in their landscape painting, we even look at our beautiful Van Rysdale in the Timken collection, that often the Dutch, and even suggested here, that things are going to change, things can change momentarily. So here we have a beautiful, quiet, contemplative, elegiac preamble, but eventually a storm is brewing. The last painter I'm going to talk about, because I see we only have a minute or two, is the great Thomas Moran. And Thomas Moran, again, this is in our very own Timken collection, and he named his paintings Opus. He did a series of paintings called Opus, and he was part of a very interesting family of artists. He married a Scottish, he was English to begin with. He was born in England. He eventually died in, I believe he died in Santa Barbara, but he married a Scottish woman who was an important painter. His older brother Edward was a marine painter with great accomplishment. So there was a lot of painters in his family. He loved the work of J.M.W. Turner, and he also loved travel. So he went to Italy. He did studies of Mexico. And the one thing about Moran, he was instrumental in starting the national parks. And if you look at that, you say, national parks in America, this is Italy. But of course, he was really well known for his great landscape paintings of the Rocky Mountains, great, magnificent landscape paintings. But because this exquisite painting is in the Timken collection, I decided to show this one because you can actually see it. So the Campagna at sunset, this is the countryside outside of Rome. You see these great ruins, this magnificent ruins of the city. You can see in the distance St. Peter's Cathedral, very slightly funny that another building that Bernini was involved with. So you see Rome in the distance right here. You see the rooms outside, and it's a very solitary, exquisite painting. And it seems to be the light as it's falling in sunset, because you can understand that the light, even in the beginning of the day or the end of the evening, really attracted these artists. And I mentioned this too, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with this painting, but one of the hardest times of the day for artists to paint is night. And many of them don't do a lot of night paintings. It's much easier to do a sunset or a morning painting, but suffice to say, it does not take away from the beauty of this landscape. So the horizon is breaking. He loved the countryside. Some people say he even kind of sat outside and just sketched and sketched, and then would bring these sketches back to his studio to complete. So I basically sort of covered, Haley, if there's any questions, I would be happy to entertain those. And I really like questions, so please feel free. No question is uninteresting to me. Hi, are there any questions?
So far, I do not see any questions in the chat.
I'm going to go back through, and if there's any questions that people might, I love these paintings so much. I have to kind of go back and look at them again. So Timken, San Diego Museum of Art. This is our Timken painting, Timken. And you can see we have such a marvelous collection of these works. Timken, Timken, and oh, I just really wanted, I don't know if I mentioned this, but this is actually at Crystal Bridges, and this was taken from the New York Public Library. So I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but it was purchased for 35 million by one of the Alice Walmart, Walton. And so she's an heiress to the Walmart fortune. And so she conceived of this Crystal Bridges, and it is in Bentonville, Arkansas. And if you ever have a chance to go visit this museum, I highly recommend it. It's all based on American painting.
Karen, I have one question in the chat for you.
Sure.
It says, was the magnolia actually painted on velvet?
You know, what I think is that it's put on velvet. Yes. So this red cloth, I'm sorry, let me just get to the painting so we can kind of see it. Yeah. So he sets the magnolia blossom on this beautiful velvet cloth, and it just brings out the richness of the foliage. And as I mentioned earlier, he did mostly blue velvet, 14 others, I believe. But yes, it just, instead of putting it in a vase of water as the Dutch and Flemish still life painters did, he has this cut branch and just is lying, he lays it out on the velvet and then captures its beauty. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think that's what you were looking for, perhaps.
I have another question. It says, are all of the Timken paintings that you showed on display?
Great question. All but, let me show you. This is the only one that is not currently on display. This one, and it's in our American gallery. And I love this painting. And what I love to do is compare it with the Lane painting, because you see one is so Turner-esque, this man being thwarted by nature, the boat's going to capsize. And then you have a more Constable-like view of a quiet harbor. So this one is on view, but this one is currently not. But I'm sure it'll come back sometime. We have other paintings there now, but this is the only one that isn't on view right now. That's Timken. But half of the paintings that I showed today are on view in our American gallery. It's a great collection. I highly recommend, if you can take the time to view it, it would be a great experience. Any other questions, perhaps?
I think that's it.
Well, I really appreciate the audience. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed looking at some of these great American landscape and seascape painters. They never fail to impress me when I look at them. And then you can think about the history and our own country and see its beauty and grandeur. So I guess we will sign off. Is that correct, Haley?
Yes, thank you so much again for the awesome tour today, Karen. It was a pleasure getting to watch your lecture again. For everyone else, thank you so much for joining today. If you would like to go back again to this lecture or any other previous lectures that have been hosted by the Timken, feel free to go to our Facebook page and you can watch any lecture that you like. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope to see you all next time.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.